1884, Orleans. The Creole who buried his peers until he saw something writing down his evil deeds. Under the suffocating heat of the summer of 1884, the city of New Orleans hid more than music and perfume in its air. Beneath the humid skies and gas-lit streets, something else was being buried. Not by time, but by a man whose soul was already half entombed. His name was Etienne Marceau, a Creole undertaker known for his impeccable grace and unshakable calm. They said his hands could make even the wicked look peaceful in their coffins, but those same hands would soon tremble for the first time. It began with a funeral no one was meant to witness. 3 men, all from families of influence, vanished without a trace. And yet, in the dead of night, Etienne was seen carrying wooden boxes to the far end of Saint Roch Cemetery, where no record of burial existed. The gravedigger who saw him never spoke again, not out of fear of Etienne, but of what followed. Rumors spread like the Mississippi mist that the undertaker was not burying bodies, but burying sins. They said he had struck a secret bargain with priests, politicians, and plantation heirs, a silent covenant to conceal the deeds they couldn't confess. For every secret he covered, his pockets filled with gold and his conscience with ghosts. Still, Etienne told himself it was survival, not evil. After all, New Orleans in 1884 was a city of masks, where bloodlines, religion, and power intertwined like the vines that strangled the old houses. He simply learned how to play the game. Until one night, when the veil between the living and the dead tore open just enough for him to see what was truly watching. It was during a late burial. No moon, only a lantern flickering in the damp wind. Etienne was alone, or so he thought, as he lowered the coffin of a man who had once whipped slaves beneath his sugar estate. The ground was soft, almost breathing, and as the last shovelful of dirt fell, Etienne heard a faint scratching from inside the coffin. He froze, then silence. He told himself it was the echo of his own fear, a trick of the night, but when he lifted his lantern to leave, he saw it. Faint lines forming across the wet earth, like invisible fingers writing from below. The words appeared slowly, one by one, until they became unmistakable. He buries them as he buried his own. Etienne dropped the lantern. The flames sputtered, lighting the letters in a trembling glow. He didn't know yet, not then, that this was only the beginning, because by the time the sun rose, more words would appear, not on the soil, but on the walls of his mortuary. And those words, he would soon learn, were not warnings. They were records. Stay with me until the end, because the truth behind what Etienne saw that night has been sealed for over a century. And tonight, you'll be one of the few to uncover it. New Orleans in 1884 was a city split between 2 worlds, one drenched in gold and perfume, the other in sweat and blood. The streets trembled with the pulse of jazz not yet named, and beneath the melody lurked whispers of the old order refusing to die. The Civil War had ended nearly 20 years before, yet its shadow still lay heavy across Louisiana. In the narrow alleys between St. Louis Street and the Bayou, the line between freedom and servitude blurred like the fog rising off the river. The Creole community lived at that crossroads, neither white nor black in the eyes of society, but trapped between both. They were educated, elegant, and haunted. Their blood carried the echoes of masters and the cries of the enslaved. Etienne Marceau was one of them. Fluent in French, precise in manner, and devoted to his work as an undertaker. In a city where the dead outnumbered the living, men like him were essential, and sometimes feared. The cemeteries of New Orleans were cities of their own. Stone walls guarded narrow aisles of tombs stacked like houses, each marked with symbols of family pride or divine forgiveness. They called them cities of the dead, and at night, when the gas lamps flickered out, the marble angels seemed to breathe. Etienne's workshop stood just beyond Saint Roch, where the moss grew thick and the ground sank after rain. There, among the scent of embalming oils and candle smoke, he performed his quiet rituals, dressing bodies, sealing coffins, whispering prayers in French Creole so no soul would linger too long. But the city was changing. A world exposition had come to town, promising progress and modernity. Electricity was being tested, and the rail lines spread out like veins across the delta. Yet with every spark of light, darkness pushed back harder. Churches warned of spirits displaced by the growth of the living. Former slaves spoke of restless ancestors denied proper burial. And among the wealthy Creoles, there was a growing fear, not of death, but of exposure. Late-night carriages stopped by Etienne's mortuary without records. He was paid to bury men without names, women without pasts. Private requests, they called them. The city's elite needed their secrets buried deeper than any grave could hold. Etienne, bound by silence and necessity, obeyed. But each night, as the city hummed beyond his walls, he began to feel the weight of something unseen pressing closer. The mortuary itself became part of the mystery. Its walls seemed to absorb the laments of the dead. Some nights, the temperature dropped suddenly, so cold his breath turned to mist even in the Louisiana heat. Once, a candle burned backwards, wax flowing upward against gravity. He told himself it was exhaustion, that grief played tricks on the eyes. But when the parish priest came to bless the place, his hand trembled mid-cross, and he left before finishing the prayer. Outside, the city kept pretending nothing was wrong. The French Quarter glimmered with masquerades, the riverboats laughed with music, and politicians made speeches about renewal. Yet in the cemeteries, in the forgotten alleys, and under Etienne's trembling hands, something older stirred, a presence too patient to reveal itself all at once. It watched through flickering candlelight, through the thin veil between duty and guilt. And it waited silently for Etienne to make one final mistake, the one that would bring its name back from the dirt. Etienne Marceau was a man of contradictions. To the public, he was composed and meticulous, a gentleman undertaker whose black coat never wrinkled and whose hands never shook. But behind closed doors, the calm mask faltered. He lived alone above his mortuary, surrounded by ledgers, crucifixes, and portraits of the dead. He kept every photograph that families left behind, saying it was out of respect. In truth, he could not bear to let the faces go. His father had been born a slave and freed before Etienne's birth, his mother a French Creole woman of fading nobility. From her, he inherited the language of refinement. From his father, the quiet endurance of those who learned to bow without breaking. Yet that balance between pride and submission became a curse. Etienne moved between two worlds, but belonged fully to neither. In the eyes of the wealthy, he was a servant who dressed like a lord. To the poor, he was a man who'd forgotten where he came from. Still, he carried his duty like armor. Every burial was sacred, every coffin sealed with precision. He whispered the same prayer for all, murderer or child, rich or destitute, because he believed that the earth did not judge. But lately that faith had begun to waver. Sometimes when he closed a coffin, he felt as if the air resisted him, as if something inside refused to rest. The only person who ever saw through his facade was Clémence, a young seamstress who made burial garments for his clients. She had eyes like dark amber and a laugh that could soften the silence of death. Clémence had lost her brother to a fever years before, and she often lingered in Etienne's workshop, helping to prepare the dead. Where others saw horror, she saw peace, the stillness that came after pain. Between them grew an unspoken understanding. Both had built lives surrounded by ghosts, yet neither knew how to live among the living. One evening, as they worked side by side over a nameless corpse, Clémence noticed Etienne's hands trembling. "You've been burying too many secrets, monsieur," she said softly. not as a jest, but as a truth she felt in her bones. He looked up, startled. For a second he saw something behind her eyes, a reflection or perhaps a warning. He wanted to tell her about the strange writing in the soil, about the whisper that followed him home each night. But fear silenced him. Later that night, alone in his quarters, Etienne opened his father's old prayer book. Inside, between the yellowed pages, was a lock of hair tied with a black ribbon, his mother's. She had always warned him, "The earth remembers, my son, even when we try to forget." He closed the book and pressed it to his chest. For the first time in years, a single tear escaped his composure. Downstairs, the mortuary clock struck midnight. The air thickened. Etienne rose to check the candles, though he had lit none. When he reached the bottom of the stairs, he froze. Across the wooden table where he prepared the dead, faint letters were forming in the dust, letters shaped by no hand he could see. They spelled his name, and beneath it, one line more. "You buried him too." The next morning, the city awoke bathed in the dull gold of a Louisiana dawn, but Etienne's world felt drained of color. He stood before the table where the words had appeared, his name still faintly visible beneath the dust. He had tried to wipe them away, but the outline returned each time the light struck the surface. It was as if the wood itself had memorized the message. He told himself it was a trick. Moisture, ash, fatigue. Yet something in his chest refused to believe it. He had buried hundreds of souls, but never one who could write from beyond. Still, he needed proof. He checked his records, flipping through pages of names, dates, and locations. Each entry was precise, neat. None stood out, until he reached one dated June 3rd, 1884. The name was smudged, written hastily, and unlike the others, there was no family listed. Just 2 words: private burial. Etienne frowned. That night had been foggy, the kind of fog that swallowed sound and sense. He remembered the heavy coffin, the lack of mourners, the impatient carriage waiting by the gate. The man who delivered it had worn a silk vest and a priest's collar, though he carried no Bible. He'd handed Etienne an envelope thick with money and whispered, "This one is not to be recorded." Now, weeks later, that same grave pulsed in his memory like an open wound. He needed to see it again. That evening, under a bruised sky, Etienne carried his lantern to the cemetery. The streets were empty, save for a drunk humming a hymn to no one. When he reached the gate, the air felt colder, the silence heavier. He followed the narrow path toward the far end, where the weeds grew tall enough to hide the stones. The grave should have been there, third from the wall, beside a cracked angel statue. But what he found instead made his blood freeze. The earth had sunk, not as if the coffin had rotted, but as if something had moved beneath it. A hollow curve, perfectly smooth, like a tunnel pressed upward from below. He knelt, brushing aside the grass. There were markings in the soil, faint lines, almost like handwriting. He leaned closer, holding the lantern low. The pattern was unmistakable, the same letters that had appeared on his table. Then, from beneath the ground, came a sound so soft it could have been imagined, the scrape of fingernails against wood. Etienne staggered back, his lantern shaking. The sound stopped. He waited, breath caught between prayer and panic. Only silence answered. He turned to leave and noticed something else. Near the base of the angel statue, half buried in mud, lay a piece of paper sealed with wax. It bore no name, only a symbol. A serpent coiled around a cross. He hesitated, then broke the seal. Inside was a single sentence written in elegant French. "The one who buries sin will be buried by it." A gust of wind blew through the cemetery, snuffing out his lantern. Etienne stood frozen in the darkness, clutching the note as if it were his only tether to reality. Somewhere, in that endless quiet, He thought he heard it again, the faint scratching of something that refused to stay buried. The following days turned into a fever of doubt. Etienne went through his routines like a ghost, preparing bodies, receiving mourners, keeping his voice steady even as his hands began to tremble with every nail he hammered shut. The note haunted him. Its words echoed through his mind each time he touched the soil. The one who buries sin will be buried by it. He tried to dismiss it as some cruel jest, perhaps from a rival mortician or one of the city's many self-proclaimed mystics. But deep down, Etienne knew the handwriting. Precise, slanted, aristocratic, it belonged to the same class of men whose secrets he had been paid to conceal. Men who had treated others like property, men whose cruelty had filled his coffins. He began noticing inconsistencies in his old ledgers, missing names, blank entries, payments that came from estates tied to plantations long abandoned. He recalled whispers he had overheard years ago, rumors that after the war, some Creole families continued to keep laborers hidden, calling them indentured, but chaining them just the same. The authorities never intervened. The city needed its sugar, its cotton, its wealth, and Etienne, obedient, discreet, desperate to be accepted, had buried their consequences. The truth sickened him. He realized he had not merely hidden bodies. He had hidden evidence, proof of beatings, starvation, and murder, disguised as illness or accident. His skill had erased the marks of violence, washed the blood from history. Every immaculate burial he performed for the powerful had been another stone laid over justice. At night, guilt turned into hallucination. He heard knocking from beneath his floorboards, soft at first, then rhythmic, like a heartbeat. When he pressed his ear to the wood, he swore he could hear whispers rising from the cracks, prayers in dialects older than French, words he didn't understand, but somehow felt were meant for him. He stopped sleeping. He stopped eating. Then Clémence noticed. One afternoon, as sunlight cut through the dusty windows, she caught him burning one of his ledgers in the furnace. "What are you doing?" she cried, rushing to stop him. "These are your records." "They are lies," he whispered, eyes hollow. "I have buried too much." Clémence looked at him, confused but frightened. "Etienne, who are you protecting?" He hesitated. Then, with a voice breaking under its own confession, he said, "Them, the men who paid me, the ones who buried their slaves in the sugar fields, the ones who begged me to make the bodies disappear. I told myself I was only doing my duty, but it was duty to the devil." The fire flared, swallowing the last of the pages. Ash rose into the air like black snow. For a moment, there was silence between them. Then Clémence spoke softly. "You can't burn what's already written in the earth." He stared at her, her words cutting deeper than any accusation. The guilt that had been festering now took shape, a living thing, heavy and breathing behind his ribs. That night, when Etienne locked the mortuary doors, he thought he saw shadows move inside the coffins waiting for burial. Not shapes, but impressions, as if the air itself carried the outline of those he had wronged. He could feel their presence pressing against the walls, whispering through the cracks, reminding him that some sins, no matter how deep they're buried, always rise again. The storm broke over New Orleans 2 nights later, rain lashing against shutters like 1,000 tiny fists. Etienne had locked himself inside the mortuary, trying to drown out the voices that had begun to speak more clearly with every passing hour. The whispers no longer came from the floor, they came from the walls, from the coffins stacked in the next room, from the air itself. He lit every candle he could find, their flames flickering violently in the draught. The smell of damp earth filled the building, though no grave had been opened that day. When he turned toward the far corner, he noticed something strange. The wood along the baseboards was darkened, as if soaked through. He knelt to touch it, and his fingers came away smeared with mud, but this mud was warm, fresh, Following the trail, Etienne moved into the preparation room, where the scent of embalming oil mixed with something older, metallic, and raw. The floor was marked with footprints, bare, human, leading from the back door toward the table where he worked. They stopped abruptly at the edge of the slab. Above it, faint writing had appeared again in the condensation on the window pane. Not all who were buried stayed below. Stayed. A flash of lightning illuminated the room, and for a moment, Etienne saw something reflected in the glass behind him. A silhouette, thin and swaying, its head bowed. He spun around, heart pounding, but the room was empty. Only the shadows of hanging linens moved in the candlelight. Still, the smell of wet soil lingered. He stumbled toward the cellar door, driven by a force he couldn't name. It had been months since he'd gone down there. He kept spare coffins and supplies below. As he lifted the latch, a gust of cold air surged upward, carrying the unmistakable odor of decay. He took the lantern, descended the steps, and froze halfway down. The floor of the cellar was no longer solid. The packed dirt had collapsed in places, revealing cavities, tunnels branching into the dark like veins. The earth pulsed faintly, as though something beneath it was breathing. Etienne stepped closer, lowering the lantern. Its light glinted off something embedded in the soil, a rosary, half buried, beads cracked and blackened. He picked it up, and the moment his fingers closed around the crucifix, a faint whisper brushed his ear. It spoke in French Creole, the words trembling like wind through reeds. "You buried your own blood." Etienne staggered back, dropping the lantern. The flame dimmed but didn't die, revealing what the shadows had been hiding. In the nearest tunnel, a skull protruded from the dirt, its jaw twisted open as if caught mid-scream. Around it, the bones of others jutted from the walls, some still bound at the wrists with rusted chains. He recognized the marks immediately, the indentations on the skulls, the way the bones were arranged. It was no accident. These weren't old graves. They were covered, not buried. Someone had sealed them beneath his own mortuary. Etienne fell to his knees, the truth striking with unbearable clarity. His father's prayer book, his mother's warnings, the anonymous burials, all of it converged into a single realization. He hadn't been hiding the sins of others alone. He had been hiding his family's. As thunder roared above, the earth shifted slightly beneath him, releasing a sound like a groan. One of the skulls tilted forward, its hollow eyes catching the light. For an instant, Etienne thought he saw movement inside the sockets, a shimmer, a flicker of life. Then came the scratching again, this time from every direction. Not one coffin, but many. From the walls, from the ceiling beams, from the soil itself. The dead were stirring, restless and relentless, and as Etienne stumbled backward, clutching the cracked rosary to his chest, he heard them whisper in unison, voices rising through the dirt. Etienne didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. The faces beneath the floor followed him even when his eyes were open. By dawn, his mind had begun to blur the border between memory and nightmare. He sat in his office, soaked in sweat, staring at the cracked rosary resting on his desk. Its beads, once black, now seemed to pulse faintly, as if responding to his heartbeat. Clémence arrived just after sunrise, drenched from the lingering rain. The look on her face changed the instant she saw him. He was pale, trembling, eyes sunken. "Etienne," she whispered, "you look as if you've seen the devil himself." He almost laughed. "Worse," he said, "I've seen the truth." He led her to the cellar, ignoring her protests. The lantern's light trembled as they descended, illuminating the tunnels below. She gasped, covering her mouth when she saw the bones, hundreds of them, tangled in silence. But Etienne's gaze was fixed on one corner of the room, where a new tunnel had appeared overnight, the soil freshly split. Something gleamed within. He stepped forward, brushing the dirt aside until his fingers struck wood, the corner of a coffin, smaller than the rest, the lid carved with delicate symbols. Clémence caught his arm. "Stop!" she pleaded. "Leave it!" But Etienne couldn't. The symbols were familiar. A serpent coiled around a cross, the same emblem on the letter he'd found at the cemetery. He pried open the coffin, his breath shallow. Inside lay the skeletal remains of a man dressed in a tattered clerical robe. His bony fingers still clutched a leather-bound book, its cover marked by the same emblem. Etienne took the book, hesitating as the candlelight reflected off the gold lettering, Chroniques de la Pénitence, Chronicles of Penance. He opened it carefully, expecting prayers or confessions. Instead, he found names. Pages and pages of them, each followed by a date and a symbol. Some names were familiar: plantation heirs, judges, priests, and among them one name nearly made him drop the book. Etienne Marceau, his own. Beside it, a date, June 3rd, 1884, the same night of the private burial. Clémence stepped closer, reading over his shoulder. "What does it mean?" she whispered. "I don't know," Etienne said, though his voice betrayed him. His stomach turned cold. "Unless—" He froze. A faint shuffle came from the dark tunnel behind them, not the sound of wind or falling soil. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, dragging. Clémence gripped his arm. "Who's there?" No answer. Only the echo of movement, then a voice, distant and rasping, speaking in French. "The living cannot bury the dead twice." The lantern flickered violently, then went out. In the darkness, Etienne's hand tightened around the book. The air grew heavy with the scent of incense and decay. Somewhere within the blackness, something or someone breathed. And for the first time, Etienne understood. The true mystery wasn't who the buried were. It was who among the living still belonged with them. When the light returned, Etienne found himself kneeling in the dirt, clutching the Chronicles of Penance, as if it were the last thread holding him to reality. Clémence was gone. Her lantern lay shattered near the steps, its glass scattered like ice. He called her name again and again, his voice cracking under the weight of panic, but only the hollow echo of the tunnels answered. The book trembled in his hands, or perhaps it was his own trembling that made it feel alive. Etienne turned the pages frantically, desperate for understanding. The entries were organized by date, each tied to a burial, each burial tied to a sin. Next to his name, a word appeared that chilled him more than any whisper from the grave. Complicity. He turned back to the earlier pages, tracing the pattern with trembling fingers. Every name belonged to someone powerful: politicians, priests, merchants, and beside each one, the same emblem of the serpent and the cross. But in the margins, smaller handwriting bled between the lines. It spoke of a society formed in secret after the war, men who had vowed to protect their own legacies by purging evidence of their crimes. They called themselves les veilleurs, the watchers. Etienne realized with a slow, dawning horror that his family name had been part of this circle for decades. His father had not simply been an undertaker, he had been the watchers' chosen guardian, responsible for concealing their sins beneath holy soil. Etienne had inherited not a business, but a curse, a generational duty soaked in blood. The book detailed everything: payments, locations, victims. Some entries were crossed out in red ink, others had symbols beside them: an open eye, a snake shedding its skin. And in the final pages, one note stood alone: "The last of us will answer to the earth." Etienne's breath caught. The words seemed to shimmer, written as if by fresh ink. He looked closer and saw that new letters were forming below it, appearing one stroke at a time. "She answers first." His heart seized. "Clémence," he whispered. The tunnels moaned softly as if responding. He grabbed the lantern, relit it with shaking hands, and followed the narrow passage where she had vanished. The air grew colder with each step, the walls slick with condensation. Somewhere ahead, he heard faint dripping. Then beneath it the soft hum of a familiar voice, Clémence's voice, singing. It was the lullaby she'd once hummed while sewing shrouds. But here, underground, it sounded warped, slowed, almost mournful. The tunnel widened into a low chamber lined with bones, hundreds of them arranged in spirals along the walls, forming patterns of eyes and serpents. In the center stood Clémence, her back turned, the rosary he'd dropped now hanging from her hand. "Clémence," Etienne's voice cracked, "we have to leave. This place, it's not what we thought." She turned slowly. Her face was pale, her eyes distant, unfocused. "They're not angry," she said softly. "They're waiting." "For what?" "For you." Before he could move, the ground shuddered. Dust rained from the ceiling. The bones along the wall began to shift, aligning into words. Etienne watched, horrified, as the message revealed itself. The sins of the fathers lie beneath the sons. The lantern flickered violently, its flame stretching thin before bursting. Darkness swallowed them whole, and in that darkness Etienne felt the weight of unseen hands brushing his shoulders, tracing the curve of his neck, pulling him gently downward, toward the earth that had always been waiting to reclaim him. Somewhere above, thunder rolled again over New Orleans, and for a fleeting instant, Etienne thought he heard the faint sound of shovels against soil. The watchers were still at work, and this time they were burying one of their own. The night had grown impossibly dark. The storm that had threatened earlier had passed, leaving the air thick and suffocating, smelling of wet earth and decay. Etienne knelt in the center of the underground chamber, the lantern flickering in his hand, casting long, quivering shadows across the walls of bones. Clémence stood across from him, her eyes vacant yet shining with some unspoken understanding. The spirals of skulls and skeletal hands seemed to pulse, as if alive, every movement synchronized with his heartbeat. He opened the Chronicles of Penance once more, flipping to the last entry. His name stared back at him, bold and black, under the date of the private burial, June 3rd, 1884. Every detail he had tried to suppress, every ledger he thought destroyed, had been preserved by forces beyond his comprehension. The watchers had left him a record of all he had hidden, and worse, of all that would judge him. Then, faint at first, he heard the whispering again, but this time the words were clearer, forming into sentences he could almost understand. They spoke of debts owed, of promises broken, and of justice deferred. "He who buries the guilty must face the buried," they murmured. Etienne's skin prickled. He felt a cold hand slide along his spine, and he realized with a shudder that the bones themselves were shifting, rearranging to face him. Skull after skull turned, empty sockets like eyes, watching, waiting. He tried to move, but his legs refused. The weight of centuries pressed upon him. Then he saw her, a figure at the far end of the chamber, not Clémence, but someone taller, draped in a long black robe. The hood fell back, revealing a face Etienne knew all too well, the man he had buried in the corner coffin just days ago, the cleric clutching the book. But the man was not dead. His eyes glowed faintly, unholy and hollow, and he stepped forward, his presence sending vibrations through the soil. "You've hidden too much," the figure intoned. "You thought your hands alone could seal the sins of others. You were wrong. The earth remembers." Etienne stumbled backward, clutching the rosary, but the floor beneath him shifted like quicksand. The walls seemed to breathe, closing in with the weight of all he had tried to forget. And then he understood. The tunnels were alive, a network of memory and judgment, built by the watchers but fueled by the victims themselves. Clémence, still standing, raised her hands. Her voice was calm, almost serene, as if speaking to someone invisible. "They do not wish to harm us, only to remind." The figure moved closer. Etienne's heart pounded. The lantern trembled in his grasp, throwing jagged light across the chamber. Then the book in his hands began to glow faintly, letters lifting off the pages like tiny writhing specters. Names, dates, symbols. His sins, his family's sins, the sins of the powerful, all rising in luminous threads toward the ceiling. And then he saw it. A page he had never noticed before, hidden, folded deep within the leather, was a record of himself, not just Etienne Marceau the Undertaker, but Etienne Marceau the Watcher, the last in a long line of guardians who had buried not only bodies, but truths. The page bore a single sentence, written in fresh ink, as if waiting for this exact moment. The one who conceals the sins of men is now part of what he conceals. Épouvante coursed through him, the weight of history pressed upon his chest. The cleric, moving closer, whispered, "The earth calls for its own." Suddenly, the tunnel shuddered violently. Dust rained from the ceiling. Bones rattled in unison, forming arcs that glimmered in the lantern light. The chamber floor cracked, revealing a hollow below, deeper and darker than any Etienne had imagined. From the shadows, hundreds of tiny hands, skeletal and delicate, reached upward. They grasped at him, clutching his coat, his sleeves, his ankles. Clémence screamed, and Etienne's lantern fell, casting the room into near-total darkness. Yet, in that darkness, the whispers grew louder, almost chanting, "All who bury must be buried, all who hide must be revealed, the cycle is complete." Etienne felt himself being drawn forward toward the gaping hollow in the floor. And then he saw it, through the flickers of lightning outside, illuminating the chamber through cracks above. The last secret, the truth behind all the hidden graves, the coffins he had sealed, the names he had erased, the payments he had accepted, all of them led to a single horrifying revelation. He had buried not only the victims of cruelty, but his own ancestors, complicit in the very atrocities he had unknowingly perpetuated. Each family line intertwined with the city's dark sins, and each skeleton in the tunnels represented a pact sealed with blood and silence. His own blood. The cleric stepped aside, and Etienne understood that the chamber itself had become a mirror. He looked down and saw the reflection of the earth, the bones, the sins, all converging into one terrible image, himself, yet not himself. His reflection stared back with hollow eyes, accusing and unyielding. Clémence reached out to him, and her voice trembled. "Etienne, the only way to end it is to acknowledge it, to name it, to face it." With trembling hands, Etienne opened the book once more. He began to whisper each name aloud, one by one, the sound echoing through the tunnels. For every name spoken, a faint glow lifted from the page, ascending toward the ceiling. As he spoke, the pressure around him eased slightly, the weight of generations of concealment beginning to lift. And then, in the final shivering moment, the book fell silent. The chamber stilled, the bones stopped moving. The pale light of dawn filtered down through the cracks above, illuminating Clémence and Etienne. He looked around at the remnants of the night's horror, the spirals of skulls, the tunnels, the empty coffins, and finally understood the full truth. The Creole who had buried his peers had also buried himself in ignorance. And only by seeing, acknowledging, and confessing the sins of the past could the cycle be broken. Yet as he stepped toward the stairway, the faint scratching returned, this time from above the earth, whispering, "And still, we remember." New Orleans awoke unaware of the secrets that had stirred beneath it, while Etienne and Clémence emerged into a city of light, carrying the weight of centuries and the knowledge that some truths, no matter how buried, would always claw their way back into the world. Etienne emerged from the mortuary into the first light of morning, the streets of New Orleans quiet, as if the city itself held its breath. The air smelled of damp brick and river mud, familiar scents that once felt comforting, but now carried the weight of what had been uncovered. He and Clémence walked in silence, each step echoing the enormity of the secrets they had witnessed. Beneath their feet lay centuries of injustice, carefully hidden yet somehow alive, whispering through the soil and stone. The events of the night left Etienne shaken to his core. He had faced the tangible presence of the past, ghosts not only of those who had suffered, but of the sins perpetuated by men in power, many of whom had thought themselves untouchable. He realized that the act of burying bodies was inseparable from the act of burying truth. Every ledger erased, every coffin sealed, had been a thread in the web of complicity that bound the living to the dead. Clémence walked beside him, her hand lightly touching his arm, a reminder that even amidst horror, human connection endured. "What will we do now?" she asked softly, eyes reflecting both fear and determination. Etienne paused, considering the weight of her question. He understood that the answer was not in running from the past, but in confronting it. Knowledge, he realized, was both a burden and a weapon. By acknowledging the atrocities, he could begin to untangle the silent chains of complicity. The history of New Orleans itself seemed to press upon him. The city had thrived on hidden labor and silenced suffering, on social hierarchies maintained through cruelty and deception. Yet the story of Etienne and the Watchers revealed that even the most meticulous attempts to conceal wrongdoing could not erase the echoes of injustice. The past demanded recognition. It reminded him that power, unchecked and shielded by secrecy, left wounds not just in flesh, but in memory, in culture, in the conscience of a community. Etienne reflected on the lives he had touched, knowingly or not. The enslaved, the oppressed, the innocent victims whose deaths had been catalogued in hidden ledgers, all had their own voices, stifled yet insistent. Their whispers, once faint, had grown into an unrelenting call for acknowledgement. And now, having seen the chamber of bones, the tunnels beneath the mortuary, and the chronicles of penance, Etienne understood that justice was not solely a matter of law or punishment. It was a matter of remembrance. The emotional weight pressed upon him like a physical force. Fear had accompanied every step underground, but sorrow had arrived with the dawn, a grief that was both personal and collective. He recognized that his own guilt, once buried beneath duty and pride, mirrored a broader human tendency to avoid uncomfortable truths. And yet there was a glimmer of hope. Confronting these truths, however horrifying, offered a path toward redemption. Clémence stopped at the river's edge, the water glimmering in morning light. Etienne looked down at his reflection, eyes weary but resolute. The city would continue on, largely unaware of the horrors beneath it. But he and Clémence now carried the memory of what had been hidden, the silent testament of those who had suffered, and the responsibility to bear witness. In that moment, Etienne understood something essential about history itself. It is not only the record of events, but the echo of lives lived, often unnoticed, often silenced. Every act of cruelty, every hidden truth leaves its mark. And every act of acknowledgement, every story told is a small step toward justice, however belated. As they walked away from the mortuary, Etienne whispered under his breath, "We must remember, so the dead do not speak in vain." And in the quiet that followed, he felt, for the first time, a fragile sense of peace, the understanding that the past, however dark, could teach the living to act with conscience, courage, and empathy. If you've stayed with us this far, you've witnessed a story that many would rather forget, a tale of hidden sins, of justice buried beneath layers of silence, and of a man forced to confront the darkness he once helped conceal. Etienne Marceau's journey is a chilling reminder that history is never truly gone. It lives on in the earth, in the records, and in the conscience of those who dare to uncover it. Now we want to hear from you. What would you have done if you were in Etienne's place? Could you face the truth of your own complicity, or would you have turned away, just as so many did before? Type your thoughts in the comments below. Let your voice be part of the conversation, because every reflection on this dark past keeps the memory alive. And if the story of Etienne, the Watchers, and the secrets buried beneath New Orleans has gripped you, there's more waiting. By subscribing and hitting the notification bell, you'll gain access to the hidden corners of history most would prefer remained forgotten. We explore tales of injustice, mystery, and revenge, stories that uncover the shadows lurking behind the familiar. Don't just watch, engage. Share your theories, your questions, and your reflections. Join our community of viewers who seek the truth buried beneath layers of time. If you've ever wondered what horrors, mysteries, or secrets lie behind closed doors, you'll want to be part of this journey. And here's the promise. For those who watch until the end, there's always a final revelation, one last detail that transforms the story, shaking what you thought you knew. So subscribe, comment, and step into the shadows of history with us. Because some truths are too important, too shocking, to remain buried forever. Remember, every click, every comment, every shared thought helps keep history alive. Your engagement ensures that stories like Etienne's are not lost to the dust and darkness, but remembered and learned from for generations to come. The morning light had fully returned to New Orleans, painting the streets in soft gold and illuminating the city's beauty. But for Etienne and Clémence, the weight of the night lingered like a shadow that refused to dissipate. They walked in silence. The memory of the tunnels, the bones, and the chronicles of penance pressing upon their minds. Every step reminded them of the lives concealed beneath the city, the secrets carefully guarded by the powerful, and the truth that some sins could never be fully erased. Etienne paused at the edge of the river, watching the water shimmer in the dawn. The reflection of the city seemed peaceful, innocent even, yet he knew what lay beneath. "It's not just the dead who remember," he whispered to Clémence, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "It's history itself, and it has a voice we cannot ignore." Clémence nodded, her eyes scanning the horizon. "We've seen too much to turn away now. But maybe it's our duty to let these stories speak, even if no one else listens." For Etienne, the realization was bitter and sobering. The weight of guilt he had carried for so long was now mingled with a sense of purpose. He understood that the uncovering of one secret would inevitably lead to another. The city's dark corners were endless, and the Watcher's influence, though shaken, had left its mark on generations. Each grave, each ledger, each hidden name was a piece of a puzzle that the living were only beginning to comprehend. As they approached the mortuary, the wind shifted, carrying a faint, unsettling whisper. Etienne froze, listening. It was not the same voice as before, nor the sound of moving soil. This was something new, deliberate, almost like a call. Somewhere, in the hidden alleys or beneath another cemetery stone, another secret waited, patient and silent, ready to reveal itself when the time was right. Clémence glanced at him, a shadow of fear crossing her face, quickly replaced by determination. "We can't ignore it," she said. "There's more out there, more that needs to be uncovered, and if we do it, we can finally give voice to those who were silenced for too long." Etienne nodded, gripping the chronicles of penance tightly. The night's horrors had shown him the cost of ignorance and complicity, but they had also illuminated a path forward, a path where truth, once buried, could be revealed, where history could speak, and where justice, even delayed, could begin to take shape. As they stepped into the mortuary, Etienne allowed himself a fleeting glance back at the city, its streets alive with unsuspecting crowds. Somewhere beneath the cobblestones, beyond the shadows of elegant facades, another story waited to surface. Another injustice, another secret, another soul whose tale demanded to be told. And so, with heavy hearts but resolute spirits, they prepared for what was to come. Because the past never truly stays buried, and history's darkest tales are always waiting for those bold enough to uncover them. If you stayed with Etienne and Clémence through this journey, remember this: New Orleans and the world beyond it still harbors mysteries that defy time, secrets that claw back from the earth, waiting for someone to listen. And soon, another story will emerge, darker, stranger, and more unsettling than anything yet revealed. Be ready, the shadows are never silent for long.